There is a place in eastern Canada where the ground is hollow. Not in the way that all ground is technically hollow, full of roots and worms and pockets of trapped water. This is different. Beneath the forests and the farmland and the old colonial streets of Nova Scotia, there are tunnels. Long, deliberate, carefully constructed tunnels that go places they have no reason to go, connect things that should not be connected, and disappear into the earth at angles that do not match anything built by the people who came after. Historians have been trying to explain them for a long time. They have not succeeded, and tonight we are going to go down there with them. Nova Scotia is not a place that most people think about when they think about great mysteries. It sits on the eastern edge of Canada, a peninsula curling out into the North Atlantic like a question mark. The people there are practical. The land is old and weathered, salt-scraped and wind-beaten, and the history that gets written about it tends to focus on fish and lumber and the slow grinding story of colonial settlement. It is not the kind of place you expect to find something that nobody can explain. But the tunnels are there. They have always been there. The first documented reports of underground passages in Nova Scotia date back to the early 1700s, when French settlers in the Annapolis Valley began describing stone-lined corridors beneath their fields that they assumed were the work of earlier indigenous inhabitants. They did not investigate them carefully. The corridors were dark, and the settlers were busy building a new world above ground. They filled some of them in. They built over others. A few they left alone, marking them on rough maps that were later lost or filed away in colonial archives where they would sit for 200 years before anyone looked at them again. The indigenous peoples of Nova Scotia, the Micmac, had their own accounts of underground places. These were not treated as mysteries. They were sacred spaces, liminal zones between the world of the living and other worlds that existed in parallel. The Micmac oral tradition describes passages that lead to places outside of ordinary time. These accounts were dismissed by European settlers as mythology, which is what Europeans called indigenous knowledge when they did not understand it. We will come back to that, but first let us talk about the geography of Nova Scotia, because the geology of this place is part of what makes the tunnel so strange. Nova Scotia sits on some of the oldest rock in North America. The bedrock in many parts of the province is Precambrian granite, over 1 billion years old, and it does not behave the way younger rock does. It is hard and dense and resistant to the kind of natural erosion that creates caves in limestone regions. The natural cavern systems you find in places like Kentucky or the Yucatan form because slightly acidic groundwater dissolves soluble rock over millions of years. Granite does not dissolve. You cannot get a natural cave in granite without something unusual happening. And yet the tunnels are there. Some of them are lined with cut stone. Some of them have wooden beams that have partially rotted, suggesting construction dates somewhere between the 15th and 17th centuries. Some of them are carved directly into the bedrock with tool marks that archaeologists have not been able to match to any known tool, type used in North America before European contact. The question of who built them has produced more disagreement among historians and archaeologists than almost any other question in Canadian history. Let us go through the theories, one by one, because each of them reveals something true about the tunnels, even if none of them fully explains them. The first theory, and the one that most institutional historians prefer, is the French colonial explanation. France controlled much of what is now Nova Scotia from the early 1600s until 1713, when the Treaty of Utrecht transferred the territory to Britain. During that period, the French called the region Acadia, and they built a series of forts and settlements along the coastline and up the river valleys. The most significant of these was Port Royal, established in 1605, which was at the time the first permanent European settlement north of Florida in North America. Port Royal was a military installation as much as a civilian settlement. The French were aware that the British were going to try to take it, because the British were always trying to take things, and so they built it with defense in mind. Stone walls, reinforced gates, elevated positions for cannon, and according to the theory, underground escape routes. The idea is straightforward. When you build a fort in hostile territory, you build a way out. The tunnels beneath Port Royal and the surrounding area, this theory argues, were constructed by French military engineers as emergency egress routes, supply corridors, and communication passages between different sections of the fortification. This was standard practice in European military architecture at the time. The star forts of the 17th century, those elaborate geometric earthworks that you can still see in Europe and in former European colonies around the world, almost always had underground components. This explanation is satisfying in some ways. It gives the tunnels a clear origin, a clear purpose, and a clear construction timeline. It connects them to a documented historical presence. It is the kind of explanation that fits neatly into a textbook. The problem is that the tunnels do not fit neatly into Port Royal. Some of them start there, or near there, but they extend for distances that no military escape tunnel has any reason to extend. Passages have been traced for several kilometers through solid bedrock, leading away from the fort toward the interior of the peninsula in directions that do not correspond to any known French settlement or military installation. One passage documented in the 1970s by a team from Dalhousie University runs for over 4 kilometers before disappearing into a flooded section that has never been fully explored. What was on the other end of that tunnel? Where was it going? The French colonial theory does not have an answer. There's also the matter of the tool marks. Military engineers in 17th century France used specific tools to cut stone, and those tools left specific marks. The marks in some sections of the Nova Scotia tunnels do not match the marks left by those tools. They are narrower, more precise, cut at angles that suggest a different technique entirely. In the 1990s, a material scientist at St. Mary's University spent several years studying the tool marks in a section of tunnel near Windsor, Nova Scotia, and her conclusion was that at least some of the cutting had been done with tools she could not identify, using a technique she had not seen in any other North American construction context. That report was published in a specialist journal with a small circulation. It did not make headlines. It should have made headlines. The French colonial theory also struggles to account for the sheer quantity of tunnel reports spread across the entire province. Military escape tunnels are site-specific. They are built beneath particular fortifications for the defense of those particular locations. They do not extend province-wide across terrain that was mostly wilderness from the French military perspective. If every reported tunnel in Nova Scotia is a French military tunnel, the French were engaged in an underground construction program of extraordinary ambition that left no trace in any colonial record. That is not impossible, but it requires an explanation of its own. The surviving French colonial archives from Acadia are incomplete, it is true. Many records were destroyed during the expulsion of the Acadians in 1755, when British forces removed the Acadian population from the province in one of the most traumatic events in Canadian history. Some records were taken to France and are in French archives. Some were lost at sea. But the incompleteness of the archive does not mean that a province-wide tunnel program was conducted in secret and left no trace at all. Large construction projects require labor, materials, time, and organization. They produce records in the form of supply requisitions, labor contracts, engineering specifications. None of that has been found for the Nova Scotia tunnel system. The second major theory is the Micmac construction theory, and it is both more controversial and more interesting than the French colonial explanation. The Micmac have lived in Nova Scotia for at least 10,000 years, possibly much longer. Their territory traditionally covered the entire peninsula and extended into what is now New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and parts of Maine. They were, by any reasonable standard, one of the most sophisticated indigenous cultures in northeastern North America. They had complex social structures, long-distance trade networks, detailed astronomical knowledge, and a rich oral tradition that encoded practical information about the land in narrative form. What they did not have, according to most conventional archaeology, was a tradition of stone construction. This is the crux of the problem with the Micmac theory. Indigenous peoples in the northeastern woodlands generally built with wood, bark, and other organic materials that do not survive well in the archaeological record. You can reconstruct the existence of a wooden longhouse from post holes in the soil, but the structure itself is gone. Stone construction, which would leave durable evidence, is not well documented in the Micmac archaeological record, and yet there are stories. Micmac oral tradition describes a figure called Glooskap, a transformer deity who shaped the landscape of the Maritime provinces. The stories about Glooskap are not simple myths. They are layered narratives that encode geographical and historical information in symbolic form. And among those stories are accounts of passages beneath the earth that Glooskap created or revealed, passages that connect specific locations across the peninsula. Researchers who have taken these accounts seriously, and they are a minority in academic circles, have noted that several of the described passages correspond, at least approximately, to actual tunnel locations that were only documented by archaeologists decades or centuries after the stories were recorded. This is either a remarkable coincidence, or it is evidence that the stories are encoding real geographical information. The question of whether the Micmac had the technology to construct the stone-lined tunnels remains open. The assumption that they did not is based on an absence of evidence, which is not the same as evidence of absence. If a culture builds primarily with organic materials, those materials do not survive. If they also built selectively with stone, in contexts where the stonework was then concealed or filled in, we might have very little archaeological trace of that activity, even if it was extensive. Furthermore, the Micmac relationship with stone was not as simple as the textbook account suggests. There are documented examples of Micmac stone working in the form of petroglyphs, tool production, and the modification of natural rock features for ceremonial purposes. The gap between this kind of stoneworking and the construction of stone-lined tunnels is significant, but it may not be as large as it appears if we assume that the more elaborate stonework was specifically reserved for underground sacred spaces that were concealed and protected. There are Micmac elders who have said, in recorded interviews conducted by researchers over the past several decades, that the underground passages are not a mystery to their community, that they have always known about them, that the mystery is a European mystery, not an indigenous one. Those statements have generally not been given the weight they deserve in academic discussions. The third theory is the one that most professional historians refuse to discuss seriously, which is probably why it has become the most popular theory in popular media. The pre-Columbian contact theory holds that the tunnels were constructed by or for visitors from Europe or elsewhere who arrived in Nova Scotia before Columbus, before even the Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland around the year 1000. The specific candidates most often proposed are the Knights Templar, the Sinclair family of Scotland, ancient Celts, Phoenician traders, or some combination of these groups. The Sinclair and Templar theory, however, deserves a more serious look than it usually gets, Henry Sinclair was a Scottish nobleman who held the title of Earl of Orkney in the late 14th century. He was also, according to an account written by his navigator, Antonio Zeno, the leader of an expedition to the New World that took place around 1398, nearly a century before Columbus. The Zeno narrative, as it is called, is a complex document with a complicated history. It was published in 1558 by a descendant of Antonio Zeno, who claimed to be editing letters and maps from the original voyage. It describes in some detail a landmass that many researchers have identified as Nova Scotia or the surrounding region. The academic establishment has treated the Zeno narrative with suspicion, and there are legitimate reasons for that skepticism. The document has inconsistencies. Some of the geography does not match well. The manuscript chain of custody is unclear. These are real problems. But the Sinclair theory does not rest only on the Zeno narrative. There are supporting pieces of evidence that are individually easy to dismiss and collectively harder to ignore. The Westford Knight is a rock carving in Westford, Massachusetts, about 300 kilometers from Nova Scotia. It appears to depict a medieval knight with a sword and what some researchers have identified as a specific heraldic symbol associated with the Sinclair family. Most geologists who have examined it say the carving is too faint and ambiguous to be definitively identified as anything. Others say the carving style is consistent with 14th century Scottish work. The carving has been examined dozens of times by dozens of researchers over the past century, and the disagreement has not narrowed. The Newport Tower in Rhode Island is a circular stone structure of unknown origin. Local tradition has attributed it to various builders over the centuries. Some researchers argue its architectural proportions are consistent with Norse or Scottish medieval construction. Others say it was built by a colonial governor in the 17th century, though documentary evidence for that claim is less robust than usually stated. The tower was clearly constructed with some care and with knowledge of certain architectural principles. Its origin remains genuinely unclear. The Templar connection in the Sinclair theory rests partly on Henry Sinclair's genealogical connections to the order and partly on the argument that the Knights Templar, who were suppressed by the French crown in 1307, had reason to move their assets out of Europe. If the Templars had accumulated wealth, documents, or artifacts that they needed to conceal from the Inquisition, and if they had the maritime capability and the organizational structure to move those assets across the Atlantic, Nova Scotia is exactly the kind of remote, difficult-to-access location where they might have chosen to secure them. This is speculative, but it is not incoherent speculation. The Templars had substantial maritime operations. They had access to maps. They had reason to look for secure locations outside of European jurisdictions. Whether they found Nova Scotia or not is the question, and the question cannot currently be answered definitively. Let us stop for a moment and talk about why comprehensive mapping of the tunnel system has never been completed, because that is itself a significant part of this story. Nova Scotia is not a small place. The peninsula is about 580 kilometers long and up to 130 kilometers wide. The tunnel system, to the extent that it has been documented, appears to extend across a significant portion of that area. Documenting it comprehensively would require coordinated effort across private land, crown land, provincial parkland, and indigenous territory. It would require ground-penetrating radar surveys, LiDAR imaging, borehole sampling, and systematic excavation in dozens of locations. It would require funding, permissions, and institutional support. None of those things have been consistently available. The history of Nova Scotia tunnel research is largely a history of individual investigators working with limited resources, producing partial results that have been published in obscure journals, ignored by major institutions, or actively suppressed by people with an interest in the land above the tunnels. That last point is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented fact that several developers and landowners in Nova Scotia have been aware of tunnel entrances on their property and have not reported them or have filled them in, because the presence of archaeological features would complicate or halt development projects. This is not unique to Nova Scotia. It happens everywhere that development interests conflict with archaeological investigation, but it means that the documentary record of the tunnels is systematically incomplete, biased toward the accessible and the uneconomically inconvenient. The provincial government of Nova Scotia has a mixed record on this. The Nova Scotia Museum has conducted some tunnel investigations over the decades and has published some of the results, but the museum has also, at various times, been slow to act on reports of new discoveries, and its institutional position has tended toward the conservative end of the interpretive spectrum. When researchers bring evidence that challenges the dominant narrative about Nova Scotia's pre-colonial history, that evidence tends to be received with skepticism and subjected to standards of proof that discoveries confirming the dominant narrative do not face. This is a known bias in historical and archaeological research. Anomalies that challenge established frameworks require more evidence to be taken seriously than observations that confirm those frameworks. It is, in a way, the scientific method operating as it should, but it creates a systematic disadvantage for research into genuinely anomalous phenomena, and the Nova Scotia tunnels are genuinely anomalous. The people who have done the most sustained and systematic work on the tunnels are mostly amateurs and independents, working outside of institutional structures. This is frustrating for people who want clear, authoritative answers, but it is also, in a strange way, freeing. Without institutional constraints, the independent researchers have been willing to ask questions that the academics have not. One of the most important independent researchers in this field was a man named William Crooker, a Nova Scotia native who spent much of his adult life investigating the underground passages of his home province. Crooker published several books on the subject and maintained extensive files of witness, accounts, survey data, and documentary evidence. Crooker's central argument was that the tunnel system in Nova Scotia was not one thing built by one group at one time. It was a palimpsest. It was multiple layers of construction, spanning potentially thousands of years, with different sections built by different cultures for different purposes, connected and modified and extended over time in ways that made the whole system more than the sum of its parts. This is actually a fairly sophisticated archaeological argument, and it has the virtue of being consistent with the available evidence in ways that single origin theories are not. If the Micmac built some passages for ceremonial purposes, and French military engineers extended and modified some of those passages for strategic purposes, and later actors added further modifications for purposes we do not yet understand, then you would expect the resulting system to be inconsistent in its construction methods, confusing in its directionality, and impossible to explain with any single narrative. That is exactly what the tunnel system looks like. Crooker also documented something that has been largely overlooked in the popular coverage of the tunnels, which is the acoustic properties of specific chambers and passages. Several of the tunnel sections that have been entered and mapped have unusual acoustic characteristics. Sound carries much further than it should. Specific frequencies resonate in specific chambers in ways that suggest deliberate design. This is consistent with what archaeologists have found in other underground sacred spaces around the world, including the megalithic temples of Malta and certain chambers in Newgrange in Ireland, where the acoustic properties were clearly intentional and were probably central to the ceremonial function of the space. If the Micmac, or pre-Columbian visitors, or whoever built the original sections of the Nova Scotia tunnels, designed them partly as acoustic instruments, then the passages have a function that goes beyond mere transportation or storage. They were built to do something, to produce an experience, to create a sonic environment that served a purpose we may not fully understand. The acoustic chambers in Newgrange are dated to approximately 3200 BCE, making them older than the Egyptian pyramids. They were built to capture sunlight on the winter solstice and to create specific resonant frequencies that were probably used in ceremony. The builders of Newgrange were sophisticated people with detailed knowledge of acoustics, astronomy, and stone construction. They were not by any reasonable measure primitive. They were specialists operating at the limits of what their tradition had developed over generations. If the builders of some sections of the Nova Scotia tunnels had comparable knowledge, the implications are significant. They were not randomly digging holes. They were executing a sophisticated design informed by knowledge traditions that we may not yet fully understand. Let us now move from the general to the specific. Let us talk about some of the individual tunnel discoveries that have been documented over the years, because the details of specific sites reveal things that the general discussion cannot. The Annapolis Valley is the agricultural heartland of Nova Scotia, a long fertile corridor between two ridges of hills that runs roughly from Windsor in the east to Digby in the west. The valley was the center of Acadian settlement in the 17th and early 18th centuries, and it has been farmed continuously for well over 300 years. The soil has been turned and returned, structures built and demolished and built again, the landscape modified in ways both large and small over centuries of occupation. And yet the tunnels persist. In 1912, a farmer near Canning, Nova Scotia, was plowing a field when his horse broke through the surface into a void below. The farmer and his sons excavated the area and found a stone-lined passage running roughly east-west, about 2 meters high and 1 meter wide, extending in both directions beyond what they were willing to dig. The passage was dry and clear of obstructions. The stone lining was mortared with a material the farmer could not identify, grayish and hard, different from any mortar he had worked with. He reported the discovery to the local newspaper, which ran a brief story. No archaeologist came to investigate. The farmer, concerned about his horses falling through, filled the section he had excavated and continued plowing. The 1912 report sat in newspaper archives for decades. It was rediscovered in the 1960s by a researcher named Douglas Chamberlain, who was compiling accounts of tunnel discoveries in the Annapolis Valley. Chamberlain visited the farm, which was still in operation, and spoke to the grandson of the original farmer, who remembered hearing the story. Chamberlain attempted to locate the passage using iron probes, the low-tech method of pushing metal rods into the ground to find voids, and found what appeared to be evidence of the passage in approximately the location described. But he was unable to excavate, and without excavation, he could not confirm the construction details the original farmer had described. Chamberlain's files on this and dozens of other valley tunnel accounts were donated to the Nova Scotia archives after his death in 1988. They are available to researchers, but have never been systematically analyzed. A more fully documented discovery occurred in 1962 near Windsor, Nova Scotia, during the construction of a new road. A section of tunnel approximately 15 meters long was exposed by the road graders before anyone understood what they had found. By the time a local historian arrived to document the site, the construction crew had already removed most of the stone lining, which they had used as fill material in another part of the road project. The historian, a woman named Margaret Chen, who taught history at a local high school and spent her weekends documenting local heritage sites, photographed what remained, and took measurements of the passage cross-section. She noted that the floor of the tunnel was smooth and slightly cambered, designed to drain water toward one wall. The ceiling stones were cut in an arch, which is a structurally sophisticated feature, requiring careful calculation. The arch stones, the few that remained, were cut to a consistent depth and fitted without visible gaps. Chen submitted a report to the Nova Scotia Museum. The museum acknowledged receipt. Nothing further happened. The road was completed. The tunnel section was sealed beneath asphalt. Chen's photographs and measurements are in the Nova Scotia Museum's archive. They show what appears to be a well-constructed, purpose-built underground passage of unknown age. No one has formally published a detailed analysis of them. In the 1970s, the tunnels attracted the attention of researchers who were interested in them for a different reason. The decade that produced the Bermuda Triangle craze and the ancient astronauts hypothesis was also a decade of genuine interdisciplinary investigation of anomalous historical sites, and a group of researchers associated with a short-lived organization called the New England Antiquities Research Association spent several years systematically investigating underground sites in Nova Scotia and the surrounding region. Their methods were more rigorous than their reputation might suggest. They used ground-penetrating radar, then a relatively new technology, to map subsurface features without excavation. They conducted soil analysis to detect disturbed ground. They used aerial photography to identify surface features that correlated with subsurface structures. Their results were published in a series of privately printed reports that circulated among interested researchers and were cited in several subsequent investigations. The reports documented dozens of tunnel locations across the province, describing features that were consistent across sites, including the stone lining, the arched ceilings in the better preserved sections, the consistent passage dimensions, and the directional alignments. That last point is significant. The directional alignments. Several of the tunnel sections that have been documented are oriented with a degree of consistency that exceeds what you would expect from purely practical construction decisions. Many sections align with astronomical phenomena, sunrise and sunset at specific times of year, the positions of specific stars, and the orientations of the cardinal directions with unusual precision. The east-west alignments are the most common and the most precise. This is consistent with what has been found at other ancient construction sites around the world. The builders of Stonehenge, Newgrange, the pyramids, and dozens of other megalithic monuments oriented their constructions to astronomical events with a precision that required sophisticated knowledge of the sky. If the builders of the Nova Scotia tunnels were part of that same tradition, or if they were in contact with cultures that were, the astronomical orientations would make sense. The question of which culture that points to is where the debate gets complicated again. The Micmac had sophisticated astronomical knowledge. This is documented. Their traditional ceremonies were organized around the solar and lunar calendar. Their stories encode astronomical information. Their geographical orientation was partly astronomical. It is not unreasonable to suggest that underground constructions created by the Micmac would reflect astronomical orientation. But the Norse also had astronomical knowledge. The Celts, if they were here, certainly did. The Templars, if the Sinclair theory is correct, had access to ancient knowledge traditions that incorporated astronomical alignment into sacred architecture. The astronomical orientations in the tunnels do not distinguish between these possibilities. They only confirm that whoever built the tunnels was paying attention to the sky. There is a site in Pictou County, in the northern part of the Nova Scotia mainland, that is particularly interesting and particularly under-investigated. Pictou County is coal country, or was. The area was heavily mined for coal in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and the mining operations both revealed and destroyed unknown quantities of pre-existing underground features. Former miners' accounts from the late 19th century, recorded by local historians in the early 20th century, describe encountering passages that were clearly not part of the mine workings, that were lined with cut stone, that seemed to lead in directions inconsistent with the coal seams. In one account from 1887, a mine foreman named James McLean described breaking through a wall and finding a stone-lined corridor that ran perpendicular to his tunnel for as far as he could see by lamplight. The corridor was dry and clear. The floor was smooth. There were marks on the walls at regular intervals, not letters or numbers as far as McLean could tell, but regular geometric shapes, circles and lines and crosses that did not look like graffiti, but looked, he said, like a system of some kind. McLean reported this to the mine manager. The mine manager told him to fill it in and get back to work. McLean did. McLean's account was recorded by his son in a memoir that was privately printed in the 1920s. The memoir is in the Pictou County Library. The section describing the tunnel has been quoted in several books about Nova Scotia mysteries. No archaeologist has ever, as far as the record shows, gone to look for the site. The marks McLean described, circles and lines and crosses at regular intervals, are consistent with what other tunnel investigators in Nova Scotia have described in other contexts. If they are a system, if they are markers of some kind, they might represent a navigational or documentary notation that would be enormously significant to decode. But you cannot decode a notation system from a single century-old second-hand account. You need the actual marks. The actual marks are probably gone, buried under a collapsed mine shaft in Pictou County. But the fact that the same description, geometric marks, at regular intervals, appears independently in multiple accounts from different locations and different time periods suggests that the marks were a feature of the tunnel system, not an artifact of any individual witness's imagination. Let us talk about Oak Island more carefully, because it deserves a more careful treatment than it usually gets. Oak Island sits in Mahone Bay, about an hour's drive southwest of Halifax. It is a small island, about 57 hectares, thickly forested, connected to the mainland by a causeway that was built in the 1960s to facilitate treasure hunting operations. The island has been the subject of organized treasure hunting since 1795, when a young man named Daniel McGuinness discovered a circular depression in the ground that appeared to be a filled-in shaft. McGuinness and his friends began digging. They found, at regular intervals, layers of logs embedded in the shaft walls. At 90 feet, according to accounts written decades after the fact, they found a stone slab with an inscription in an unknown script. They could not continue digging because water flooded the shaft. Every subsequent excavation has faced the same problem. The shaft floods. Investigation has determined that the flooding is not natural. There are tunnels running from the pit to the ocean that serve as flood traps. When the shaft is excavated below a certain depth, the ocean water flows in through the flood tunnels and fills it. This is an extraordinarily sophisticated piece of engineering. You do not accidentally build a system like that. You build it deliberately to prevent unauthorized access to whatever is at the bottom. The question of what is at the bottom has produced theories ranging from the treasure of the Knights Templar to the original manuscripts of Shakespeare's plays, to Masonic artifacts, to Spanish pirate gold. Most of these theories are significantly more speculative than the basic engineering mystery, which is simply who built this and when and what were they hiding. The flood tunnels at Oak Island are a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering. They were built to intercept seawater from Smith's Cove on the north shore of the island and deliver it to the main shaft. The tunnels run at an angle that creates a siphon effect, and they are lined to prevent collapse. The engineering required to design and build them accurately in the 17th or 18th century without modern surveying equipment required sophisticated knowledge of hydrology, tunnel construction, and spatial calculation. Where did that knowledge come from? In the European context, comparable engineering was practiced by the military engineers who built star forts and their associated underground infrastructure. In the indigenous North American context, comparable knowledge of water management existed in certain cultures, but the specific technique of building flood tunnels to protect an underground cache is not documented elsewhere in North American archaeological contexts. The most parsimonious explanation is that the Oak Island pit was built by someone with European engineering training, probably in the 17th century, probably for the purpose of concealing something of great value. The identity of that someone is unknown. The connection to the broader Nova Scotia tunnel system is suggested by the flood tunnels themselves. The engineering required to build them is essentially the same engineering required to build the longer passages documented elsewhere in Nova Scotia. The techniques overlap. The scale of ambition overlaps. Several researchers have suggested that the flood tunnels at Oak Island are not isolated structures, but are part of the broader network, connected to passages that extend toward the mainland. This has never been proven. But the geography of Mahone Bay, with its shallow waters and its many islands, would not have prevented tunnel construction if the builders were motivated and capable, and they were clearly capable. There is an archaeological concept called a cognitive map, which refers to the internal spatial representation that people use to navigate and understand their environment. Different cultures organize their cognitive maps differently, prioritizing different features, marking space in different ways, creating different kinds of meaningful landmarks. For many indigenous cultures around the world, the underground is not a hidden or marginal space. It is a central one. The connection between the surface world and the world beneath the surface is a fundamental organizing principle of cosmology, ceremony, and daily life. The entrance to the underground is an entrance to something real and important, not a metaphor. If you approach the Nova Scotia tunnels with a cognitive map organized around the sacredness of underground space, you interpret them very differently than if you approach them as a military engineer looking for strategic utility or an economist looking for a treasure repository. For a researcher working within the Micmac tradition, the question is not who built the tunnels and why, but what the tunnels connect and what moves through them, and how the network relates to the sacred geography of the peninsula as a whole. The answers to those questions are encoded in the oral tradition. They have been maintained by Micmac knowledge keepers through centuries of colonial disruption and suppression. This knowledge has not been widely shared with outside researchers, for reasons that should be obvious. Colonial research relationships have a poor track record when it comes to indigenous knowledge. Information shared in good faith has been used, misrepresented, commercialized, and stripped of its context. The people who hold the knowledge have learned to be careful. There have been, however, some collaborative research projects between academic archaeologists and Micmac community members that have produced new insights. A project conducted in the 2000s involving researchers from St. Francis Xavier University and members of the Eskasoni First Nation explored several tunnel sites in the Cape Breton Highlands with community guidance. The results of that project are partially published and partially held within the community at the community's request. What the published portion reveals is that several tunnel sites in Cape Breton correspond to locations that are significant in Micmac oral tradition, locations associated with specific stories involving Glooscap and other important figures. The correspondence is not approximate, it is precise. The sites are exactly where the stories say they should be. This is significant for several reasons. First, it suggests that the oral tradition is encoding accurate geographical information about specific underground locations. This is not unusual for oral traditions, which regularly maintain precise geographical knowledge over long time periods. Second, it suggests that the Micmac community has continuous knowledge of the tunnel network extending back to before European contact. This does not prove that the Micmac built the tunnels, but it does suggest they have always known about them and have incorporated them into their sacred geography. Third, it raises the question of what other information the oral tradition encodes about the tunnels that has not been shared with outside researchers. If the location information is accurate, the functional information might be as well. Let us move now to the eastern end of the province, to Cape Breton Island, where some of the most interesting and least publicized tunnel discoveries have been made. Cape Breton is connected to the mainland of Nova Scotia by a causeway. The island is characterized by the Cape Breton Highlands, a rugged plateau that is geologically continuous with the Appalachian Range, and by the Bras d'Or Lakes, a brackish inland sea that occupies the center of the island. The Micmac have inhabited Cape Breton for thousands of years and consider it one of the most sacred territories in their homeland. In the 1980s, a contractor excavating for a foundation in the town of Sydney came across a section of cut stone tunnel running beneath what was then a vacant lot. The tunnel was approximately the same dimensions as passages documented elsewhere in Nova Scotia: arch ceiling, smooth floor, stone lining. The contractor photographed the section, noted its dimensions, and then filled it in because the development timeline did not permit a delay for archaeological investigation. The photographs were eventually acquired by a researcher named Robert Macaulay, who had been collecting documentation of tunnel discoveries in Cape Breton for several years. Macaulay compared the construction details in the Sydney photographs with details from documented tunnels elsewhere in the province, and concluded that they were consistent enough to suggest a common origin or at least a common construction tradition. Macaulay also documented several surface features in Cape Breton that he believed corresponded to subsurface tunnels. Linear depressions in the landscape that followed specific alignments, circular hollows that had been noted in various historical records as places where the ground sounded hollow when struck, and a series of unusual rock formations near the coast that he believed were associated with tunnel entrances. The linear depressions are particularly interesting. They are faint, often visible only from aerial perspectives or in particular light conditions, but they show up consistently in aerial photographs and in LiDAR imagery where it has been applied. A linear depression in the landscape is exactly what you would expect to see above a tunnel that has partially collapsed over time, as the ground above it settles into the void left by the collapsing roof. The pattern of depressions Macaulay documented in Cape Breton suggests a network of passages crossing the island, connecting the Bras d'Or Lakes region with the northern coast, and with several locations that are significant in Micmac tradition. Whether that pattern reflects actual tunnels or is an artifact of other geological processes is a question that requires investigation that has not been done. Macaulay's work was self-published and distributed on a limited basis. He died in 2003 without completing the synthesis he had planned. His papers are held by his family and have not been formally archived. The pattern here is becoming familiar. Individual researchers accumulate evidence, reach preliminary conclusions, fail to find institutional support, and die or give up before their work can be properly integrated into the broader record. The evidence exists. The analysis is partial. The synthesis has not been done. There is a question that has been circling this entire discussion, and it is time to address it directly. Why does this matter? Why should anyone care about tunnels in Nova Scotia that may or may not be connected to each other, that may or may not predate European contact, that have been documented in fragmentary fashion by a scattered collection of independent researchers over more than a century? There are several answers. The first is the historical answer. If the tunnel system is as extensive as the accumulated evidence suggests, it represents the largest and most sophisticated pre-colonial construction project in North America, north of Mexico. Understanding who built it, when, and why would fundamentally revise our understanding of pre-contact North America. The narrative that indigenous North America was primarily characterized by small, mobile, technologically simple societies would need serious revision. The narrative that Europe had no meaningful contact with North America before Columbus would need serious revision. The history of the continent would look different. The second is the cultural answer. The Micmac have maintained oral traditions about the underground passages for thousands of years. Those traditions have been dismissed by the mainstream as mythology. If the tunnels are confirmed to be what the tradition says they are, it vindicates indigenous knowledge systems in a way that has implications well beyond Nova Scotia. It would be another case, in a long series of such cases, where oral tradition turned out to be accurate historical documentation that Western scholarship had failed to recognize. The third is the engineering answer. Whoever built the more sophisticated sections of the tunnel system, the stone-lined passages with arch ceilings and drainage channels and acoustic chambers, had engineering knowledge that we do not currently attribute to any known culture operating in North America in the relevant time period. Understanding how that knowledge got to Nova Scotia and what tradition it was part of would tell us something important about the transmission of technical knowledge across cultures and continents. The fourth is the simpler answer. The tunnels are mysterious, and mysteries matter for their own sake. The compulsion to understand what we do not understand is not a trivial thing. It is one of the foundational drives of human civilization. The relationship between the tunnel system and the tidal patterns of the Bay of Fundy is worth spending some time on, because it is one of the more technically interesting aspects of the mystery. The Bay of Fundy has the highest tidal range on Earth. At its maximum, near the head of the bay around Parsboro and Truro, the tidal difference between high and low water can exceed 16 meters. This means that twice a day, 16 meters of water flows into the bay and then flows out again. The tidal flow generates enormous hydraulic pressure in the near-shore environment, and anything built underground near the bay must account for that pressure or be destroyed by it. The fact that tunnel sections have been found intact near the Bay of Fundy shoreline, sections that are apparently well sealed and have survived centuries of tidal pressure, suggests that the builders understood the tidal environment and engineered their constructions accordingly. This is not a trivial engineering achievement. Modern marine engineers take tidal pressure very seriously when designing coastal infrastructure. The Oak Island flood tunnels are the most elaborate example of tidal engineering in the Nova Scotia system, but they are not the only one. Several tunnel sections that have been found in intertidal zones or near the high water mark show evidence of deliberate waterproofing, using mortar compositions that resist water infiltration in ways that standard construction mortars do not. The specific mortar compositions used in some sections of the tunnel system have been analyzed in the few cases where samples were taken before the sections were destroyed. The analyses have produced surprising results. Some samples contain materials that are not locally available in Nova Scotia, materials that would have been imported from other regions. The presence of non-local materials in the mortar does not prove where the builders came from, but it does suggest that the tunnel construction was connected to trade networks that extended beyond the province. A Micmac, long-distance trade network that reached beyond the Maritimes, is historically documented. The Micmac traded extensively with other indigenous peoples across northeastern North America, and there is evidence of trade contacts that extended much further. A European or Asian trade contact that reached Nova Scotia before the documented colonial period is more controversial, but not inherently less plausible. In 2018, a team of researchers from various institutions attempted, for the first time, to compile a comprehensive database of documented tunnel sightings and discoveries in Nova Scotia. The project was led by Dr. Claire Arsenault, a geoarchaeologist at Dalhousie University, and was funded by a small grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Arsenault's team spent 2 years going through historical records, newspaper archives, museum collections, and the files of independent researchers to assemble a systematic catalog of documented tunnel encounters. They also conducted a series of field investigations using ground-penetrating radar at 14 sites where tunnel presence had been reported. The published results of the project, which appeared in the journal Canadian Archaeological Review in 2020, are cautious in their conclusions, as academic publications tend to be, but the data they present is remarkable. The catalog documented 387 distinct reports of tunnel encounters in Nova Scotia, spanning the period from 1712 to 2017. The reports came from all parts of the province. They described features that were consistent enough across reports to suggest a common construction tradition. The ground-penetrating radar surveys confirmed subsurface anomalies at 11 of the 14 sites investigated, anomalies consistent with the presence of tunnels or tunnel remnants. Arsenault concluded that the available evidence supported the existence of an extensive, province-wide network of constructed underground passages, whose builders and construction timeline remained undetermined. She recommended further investigation, noting that the evidence did not support any single origin theory and was most consistent with a multi-period construction history. The paper received little attention outside of specialist circles. There was no press release. There was no media coverage. The findings were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary, confirmed evidence of an unexplained province-wide underground network in Canada. That should be news. It was not news. That failure of attention is itself something worth examining. The tunnels have been discussed in popular books and documentaries for decades. Oak Island has a television series. Nova Scotia history is a subject of genuine public interest in Canada and among the substantial Nova Scotian diaspora around the world. An academic paper confirming a province-wide underground network and recommending further investigation should have generated at least some public discussion. The fact that it did not may reflect the academic caution of the paper itself, which carefully avoids any of the more dramatic, theoretical claims that would attract popular attention. It may also reflect the degree to which the tunnel story has been associated in public consciousness with the treasure-hunting fringe, in a way that makes serious academic engagement seem less credible than it actually is. Either way, the paper is there, the data is real, the anomalies have been confirmed, the explanation has not been found. Let us talk about the salt marshes. The Acadian settlers who came to Nova Scotia in the 17th century were farmers, and they were brilliant ones. They developed a system of aboiteaux, wooden sluice gates set into earthen dikes that allowed them to reclaim salt marshes from the tidal flats of the Bay of Fundy and the Minas Basin. These reclaimed marshes were enormously fertile, and the aboiteaux system was so effective that it was adopted by later settlers after the Acadians were expelled in 1755. Some of the aboiteaux are still functioning. Others are ruins, And in the process of maintaining and reconstructing dike systems over the centuries, workers have repeatedly encountered underground passages beneath the salt marshes that do not correspond to any known drainage or construction project. The connection between the tunnel system and the salt marshes is puzzling, because the salt marshes are a difficult environment for underground construction. The high tidal variation on the Bay of Fundy makes any underground structure in the tidal zone subject to extreme hydrostatic pressure. Building a stable passage in that environment would require sophisticated engineering of the same kind used in the Oak Island flood tunnels. Several researchers have suggested that the passages beneath the salt marshes were constructed during a period when sea levels were lower and the current salt marsh areas were dry land. If the passages were built during a low sea level stand and then inundated as sea levels rose, they would be much older than any of the historical or colonial period explanations allow. The last major sea level low stand in the region was approximately 8,000 years ago, before the current interglacial period. If some of the deepest and most water-damaged tunnel sections were built during that period, they would be among the oldest constructed features in North America, predating any known North American civilization by thousands of years. This is the outer edge of speculation, but it is speculation grounded in real geological and hydrological data. The sea level history of the Bay of Fundy is well documented. The presence of passages in areas that would have been dry land 8,000 years ago is not impossible. It is simply not something that current archaeological frameworks are prepared to take seriously. The reason those frameworks are not prepared to take it seriously is that it would require positing the existence of a sophisticated construction culture in northeastern North America approximately 8,000 years ago, a culture sophisticated enough to cut and line stone passages for which there is currently no other archaeological evidence. The absence of corroborating evidence is a serious problem for this hypothesis, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Archaeological research in North America has repeatedly found evidence of sophisticated pre-contact cultures in places where such cultures were not previously suspected. The Cahokia Mounds complex in Illinois, the earthworks of the Ohio Valley, the sophisticated agriculture systems of the Amazon basin, the hydraulic engineering of the Maya lowlands. All of these were invisible to European settlers and subsequently to early American archaeologists because the researchers were not looking for them. They were found eventually because someone looked. The question of indigenous rights and the tunnels has become more complex in recent years. Under Canadian law, provincial and federal governments have consultation obligations with Indigenous peoples when development projects may affect areas of cultural or heritage significance. The Supreme Court of Canada has, through a series of decisions over the past 3 decades, clarified and expanded those obligations. Archaeological discoveries on Crown land or land subject to development trigger consultation requirements. This means, in principle, that the discovery of tunnel sections during construction projects should trigger consultation with the Micmac before work proceeds. In practice, the consultation process is often minimal. The developer's obligation is often discharged with a brief meeting and a letter, and the archaeological features are often destroyed before meaningful investigation can occur. The Micmac nation has been increasingly assertive about its rights over archaeological sites in Nova Scotia. The Assembly of Nova Scotia Micmac Chiefs has issued statements about the tunnel network and other underground sites, asserting that these are part of Micmac heritage and must be treated accordingly. This has created friction with developers and with some academic researchers who would prefer a purely scientific approach to the tunnels. The Micmac position is that the tunnels cannot be understood outside of the cultural and spiritual context that the Micmac tradition provides. The academic position is often that the tunnels must be studied objectively, without being filtered through any particular cultural framework. These are not entirely incompatible positions, but reconciling them requires a degree of mutual respect and epistemic humility that has not always been present in the relationship between Indigenous communities and academic institutions. A genuinely collaborative approach to the Nova Scotia tunnel system, one that took Micmac oral tradition as seriously as archaeological data, and that was conducted with the informed consent and active participation of Micmac knowledge keepers, has not yet been attempted at the scale the subject deserves. Preliminary efforts suggest it would produce results significantly richer than purely Western scientific investigation has produced so far. The potential value of such a collaboration goes both ways. The Micmac community would gain recognition for their heritage and for the accuracy of their oral tradition. The academic community would gain access to knowledge that cannot be obtained through purely physical investigation. The public would gain a richer and more accurate understanding of the history of northeastern North America. The barriers to that collaboration are real. They include a long history of extractive research, relationships, a legal framework that is still developing, and institutional inertia on both sides. But the barriers are not insurmountable, and the potential benefits are large. Let us return to the physics of the tunnels, because there is something there that gets lost in the historical and cultural debates. The arched ceiling sections, where they are well preserved, are engineering achievements of a specific kind. A true arch, as opposed to a corbelled arch, distributes weight differently and can span a wider gap without central support. True arches require the calculation of the keystone, the central wedge-shaped stone at the crown of the arch, at the correct angle to transfer load to the abutments. This calculation requires geometric knowledge. The Romans were the first Western civilization to use true arches extensively, beginning around the 4th century BCE. In North America, true arch construction is not documented before European contact, based on current mainstream archaeology. A true arch in a pre-contact North American context would be an anomaly of the first order. Several of the documented tunnel sections in Nova Scotia appear to have true arch ceilings. The documentation is not always detailed enough to be certain, but in cases where cross-sectional measurements are available, the geometry is more consistent with a true arch than a corbelled one. If the arch sections predate European contact, the implications are significant. They would suggest a knowledge tradition in North America that parallels developments in the Old World, either independently or through contact. If they date to the French colonial period, the engineering is consistent with what French military engineers would have been capable of and would have used. This is the safe interpretation, and for sections of the tunnel near documented French installations, it is probably correct. But some of the arch sections are in locations far from any French installation, in directions that French military engineers would have had no practical reason to build. For those sections, the French colonial explanation requires an additional assumption that has not been demonstrated, that the French were building underground infrastructure in remote areas of the interior for reasons not documented in any colonial archive. The absence of documentary evidence is always a complicated evidentiary problem in archaeology. Documents are lost, destroyed, never created in the first place, or deliberately suppressed. The absence of French archives documenting tunnel construction does not prove the French did not build them, but it is another piece of the puzzle that does not fit neatly. There is also the drainage channel question. Several tunnel floors have what appear to be deliberately cut drainage channels running along one side, designed to collect and direct water away from the passage. This is not a feature you find in emergency escape tunnels, which are used briefly and infrequently. It is a feature you find in passages that were designed for long-term use, passages where managing water accumulation was important enough to engineer a permanent solution. Long-term use passages, passages that were expected to be in service for extended periods, walked regularly, maintained, important enough to invest in drainage infrastructure. What were they for? In 2021, a hobbyist using a commercially available ground-penetrating radar unit documented what appeared to be a tunnel entrance in a hillside near Annapolis Royal, close to the site of the original Port Royal. The hobbyist, a retired engineer named Paul Landry, spent several weeks surveying the area and produced a series of radar images showing a clear subsurface void, consistent with a passage running approximately 30 meters into the hillside. Landry submitted his documentation to the Nova Scotia Museum. The museum acknowledged receipt and noted that the site would be added to its database of potential archaeological sites. No investigation has occurred since then. Landry posted his findings on a local history forum and uploaded the radar images to a community website dedicated to Nova Scotia heritage. The forum discussion produced several responses from people in the area who were aware of local legends about tunnels near Annapolis Royal, including references to entrances that had been sealed in the 19th century and to stories of children exploring passages before the entrances collapsed. This kind of distributed informal documentation, local legends corroborated by modern detection technology, corroborated in turn by historical records and independent researcher accounts, is typical of how the tunnel evidence accumulates. Each piece is individually ambiguous. The accumulation is harder to dismiss. The Annapolis Royal area is particularly rich in this kind of layered documentation. It is one of the oldest continuously occupied European sites in North America. The French built there first. The British took it. The Acadians farmed around it. The Micmac had been there for thousands of years before any of them. Multiple layers of occupation, multiple layers of construction, multiple reasons to build underground, multiple communities with oral traditions about what is beneath the ground. If there is a location in Nova Scotia where the palimpsest model is most likely to be confirmed, it is probably within a few kilometers of Annapolis Royal. The site is archaeologically important in ways that are already recognized. The additional investigation required to address the tunnel question would not need to be conducted in isolation from the existing archaeological research. It would be an extension of it. The fact that it has not been done is a choice, not an inevitability. There is one more thread to pull on before we bring this together, and it is the thread that leads to the sea. Nova Scotia is a peninsula almost completely surrounded by ocean. The history of the province, from its earliest indigenous inhabitants through its colonial settlement, is fundamentally a maritime history. The sea was a highway, a food source, a barrier, a threat, and a constant presence in the lives of everyone who lived here. Several documented tunnel sections appear to terminate at or near the current coastline, or at points that would have been the coastline at various historical sea levels. This has led some researchers to propose that the tunnel system was partly a maritime infrastructure, providing hidden access between the interior and the sea. The implications of that idea are far-reaching. If the tunnels were designed to allow movement between inland locations and the coast without being observed from the surface, they would have been enormously valuable for anyone engaged in clandestine maritime activity. Smuggling, intelligence operations, the movement of high-value cargo that could not be transported overland without risk of discovery. This is consistent with the Templar or Sinclair theory. If an expedition arrived on the coast of Nova Scotia in the late 14th or early 15th century, carrying something they needed to conceal and protect, a system of tunnels leading from the coast to a secure inland location would be exactly what they would need. The Money Pit on its island in the bay would be a logical terminal point for such a system. It is also consistent with the French colonial period. The Acadians and their French military protectors were involved in complex intelligence and smuggling operations throughout the colonial period, particularly during the series of wars between France and Britain that characterized the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Hidden maritime access would have been strategically valuable. The French were losing. They needed every advantage they could find. A province-wide network of hidden passages would have been an extraordinary advantage. And it is consistent with indigenous maritime tradition. The Micmac were skilled mariners who traveled extensively along the Atlantic coast and across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Hidden passages providing access to the sea would have had strategic value in an era of intertribal conflict and later colonial pressure. All three of these contexts are real. All three could have contributed to the development of a tunnel system with maritime connections. The palimpsest model, multiple builders, multiple periods, multiple purposes, accommodates all of them. The key insight is that the tunnels did not need to serve the same purpose throughout their history. A passage built by the Micmac for ceremonial access to a sacred coastal location could later have been extended and modified by French engineers for military use, and could later still have been used by Acadian civilians for smuggling, and could later still have been used by treasure hunters trying to get to Oak Island without being observed. Each layer of use would have left its own marks in the archaeology, contributing to the confusion that makes the tunnels so hard to interpret. There is a word in Micmac, siknikt, that refers to the drainage basin of the Bay of Fundy. It means roughly the place that drains. The land slopes toward the water. Everything flows down and out. The Micmac have been telling stories about this land for as long as anyone has been listening. The stories are about the land, the water, the sky, the animals, and the passages between worlds. The underground is not a mystery in those stories. It is a known space, mapped and named and understood. The mystery is a European one. The Europeans came to Nova Scotia and found a landscape they did not understand, built on a history they could not read, connected to a past that their frameworks could not accommodate. They found hollow ground and did not know what to make of it. They filled some of it in, they built over the rest, but the tunnels persisted. They are still there, beneath the farms and the roads and the towns, beneath the salt marshes and the bedrock and the old colonial fortifications. They run from the coast to the interior, from the highlands to the valleys, connecting points that were significant to whoever built them in ways we do not yet fully understand. Let us draw some conclusions, tentative as they must be given the state of the evidence. The underground tunnel system of Nova Scotia is real. This is not a fringe claim. It is documented by nearly 300 years of independent reports, by physical evidence in the form of surviving tunnel sections, by geological survey data, and by the recent academic catalog published by Dalhousie University. Whatever the tunnels are and whoever built them, they exist. The single origin theories are all inadequate. The French colonial theory explains some sections and not others. The Micmac theory explains the oral tradition and the archaeological distribution, but requires accepting forms of indigenous technological capability that mainstream archaeology has not yet acknowledged. The Pre-Columbian contact theory explains the anomalous tool marks and the astronomical alignments, but requires accepting historical claims that are contested and partly based on unreliable documents. The palimpsest theory, which holds that the system was built over multiple periods by multiple actors, is most consistent with the totality of the evidence. It is also, frustratingly, the hardest theory to confirm, because it requires comprehensive investigation of the entire system, not just individual sections. The system has not been comprehensively investigated. This is partly a resource problem, partly a political problem involving indigenous rights and development interests, and partly an institutional problem rooted in the academic preference for caution over ambition. The Micmac oral tradition almost certainly encodes accurate information about the tunnels. The portions of that tradition that have been shared with outside researchers suggest that the oral tradition is a reliable guide to the system. The portions that have not been shared may contain the most important keys to understanding what the tunnels are for: the anomalies, the tool marks that do not match known tools, the acoustic chambers, the astronomical orientations, the arched sections in locations remote from known European activity, the non-local mortar materials, are real anomalies. They have not been explained. They suggest that the full story of the Nova Scotia tunnels involves knowledge, traditions, and construction capabilities that do not fit comfortably within either the European colonial narrative or the conventional understanding of pre-contact North American archaeology. The answer to the mystery is probably not a single dramatic revelation. The tunnels are probably not the hiding place of one specific treasure or one specific secret. They are probably something more interesting than that: evidence of a complex, multi-layered human history of remarkable ambition and skill, built over thousands of years by people who understood the land and the sea and the sky in ways that we are only beginning to recover. What would comprehensive investigation actually look like? It would start with a full LiDAR survey of the province, searching for the linear depressions and circular anomalies that indicate subsurface tunnel presence. LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to create detailed topographic maps, is now affordable enough that a province-wide survey is not out of the question financially. It has been used to discover thousands of previously unknown archaeological sites in places like the Cambodian jungle and the Maya lowlands. Applied to Nova Scotia, it would likely produce a detailed map of the tunnel network's surface expression within a relatively short period. It would then use ground-penetrating radar and resistivity surveys to confirm subsurface features at the most promising locations. These surveys are non-invasive and can be conducted quickly. It would then conduct targeted excavations at key sites in collaboration with the Micmac Nation, using modern archaeological methods to document construction techniques, obtain datable materials, and analyze mortar and stone composition. It would compile and analyze all existing documentation, including the Dalhousie Catalog, the museum archives, the files of independent researchers, and the records held by private landowners. And it would do all of this in genuine partnership with Micmac knowledge keepers, whose oral tradition may be the most detailed and accurate guide to the system that exists. This program would take years and significant resources. It would require collaboration between federal and provincial governments, academic institutions, indigenous communities, and private landowners. It would require the kind of sustained institutional commitment that has not been available, but the potential return would be enormous. If the tunnel system is what the accumulated evidence suggests it might be, understanding it would reshape our knowledge of North American history, vindicate indigenous knowledge traditions, and answer questions that have been building for 300 years. That seems worth doing. In 2019, a family in rural Hants County, Nova Scotia, reported that their barn had partially collapsed into a void. The void turned out to be the top of a stone-lined chamber, roughly 3 meters square, with a passage leading off in a southerly direction that the family was unable to follow because of debris and their understandable reluctance to crawl into an unknown underground space. They called the county, who called the province, who sent an inspector who determined that the structure was not an immediate safety hazard and added the location to the provincial heritage database. No archaeologist came. The family covered the hole with plywood and put the barn back together as best they could. The chamber is still there, sealed under plywood, and what remains of their barn floor leading somewhere south in the dark, somewhere under Hants County, somewhere under Nova Scotia, waiting, as it has been waiting for a very long time, for someone to come and ask what it means. The historian in that story is not the one who came. The historian is the silence that followed the inspector's visit. The historian is the plywood over the hole. But history has a way of insisting. The ground settles. The plywood warps. The void makes itself known again. The tunnels of Nova Scotia have been making themselves known for 300 years of documented European history, and for at least 10,000 years before that in the oral tradition of the people who have always lived above them. They are patient. They will keep making themselves known. And eventually, someone will have the resources, the will, the institutional support, and the wisdom to ask the right people the right questions and actually listen to the answers. When that happens, the history of this part of the world will look very different. The ground beneath Nova Scotia is hollow. It has always been hollow. And the question of why is one of the most interesting questions in North American history. We have not answered it yet, but we have not stopped asking. The stories say that Glooscap will return one day, that when the world needs him, he will come back from wherever he has been resting and put things right. Some of the elders say he went underground. Maybe the tunnels are how he plans to come back, or maybe that is mythology and the tunnels are just tunnels, built by practical people for practical reasons that we have not yet fully determined. Either way, they are there. And either way, we have been walking over them for a very long time without understanding what we are walking on. The mysterious tunnels beneath Nova Scotia that historians still can't explain. They cannot explain them yet, but the ground remembers. It always does. There is a village on the south shore of Nova Scotia called Mahone Bay, and it should not be confused with the bay of the same name which surrounds it on 3 sides. The village is small and pretty, with 3 churches whose reflections in the water have been photographed so many times that the image has become something of an unofficial symbol of the province. People who visit Mahone Bay for the first time are often struck by how quiet it is, how old it feels, how the buildings and the water and the hills behind them seem to exist in a kind of suspended moment, removed from the urgency of the present. There is a reason the village feels old. It is old, and the land it sits on is older still, and beneath that land there are things that predate the village by an interval of time so large that the village, charming as it is, becomes a kind of footnote. The south shore of Nova Scotia has been a focus of underwater archaeological interest for decades, separate from the Oak Island investigation, because the shallow coastal waters preserve organic materials that would not survive on land. Ships, dock structures, and other wooden constructions from the colonial period have been found in various states of preservation in the nearshore zone. But marine archaeologists working in Mahone Bay and the adjacent waters have also, on several occasions, reported encountering stone structures on the seafloor that do not correspond to any known shipwreck or colonial construction. These structures are at depths consistent with sea levels that existed several thousand years ago. They are not necessarily the remains of tunnels, but they raise the same question that the salt marsh passages raise. If people were building stone structures in this region during periods of lower sea level, what else were they building, and where did those constructions go when the sea rose? The answer is that most of them went underwater, which is where they remain beyond the reach of casual investigation in the dark water of the bay. The underwater component of the Nova Scotia mystery has barely been addressed. The resources required for systematic underwater archaeological survey are significantly greater than those required for land survey, and the institutional interest in funding such work in a context already considered fringe by much of the academic establishment has been minimal. What little investigation has occurred has been conducted by private divers with varying levels of archaeological training, whose reports are interesting but not rigorously documented. If comprehensive underwater survey were ever conducted in Mahone Bay and the adjacent coastal waters, it might reveal a great deal, or it might reveal nothing of significance. Without the survey, we cannot know. The bay keeps its secrets better than the land does. There is a story, told in several versions among older residents of Lunenburg County, about a tunnel that runs beneath the harbor of Lunenburg itself. Lunenburg is one of the most historically significant towns in Atlantic Canada, a UNESCO World Heritage Site whose Old Town District preserves an 18th century planned settlement, layout that is unique in North America. The story describes a passage that begins somewhere beneath the old waterfront district, runs under the harbor, and emerges on the far side at a point that various tellers locate differently, somewhere on the opposite shore or on one of the islands in the outer harbor. The purpose of the passage in the story varies. Some tellers describe it as a smuggler's route, used to move contraband between ships in the outer harbor and warehouses in the town, without passing through the customs inspection at the wharf. Others describe it as a military installation built by the original British planners of the settlement in the 1750s as an emergency escape route. A few tellers describe it in terms that suggest it predates the British settlement entirely. No documented tunnel entrance has ever been found in Lunenburg. The old town sits on a drumlin, a glacially deposited hill, and the soil conditions are not ideal for tunnel preservation. Any tunnels that might have been built in the colonial period could well have collapsed over the intervening 2.5 centuries. But the story persists. It is one of those pieces of local knowledge that gets passed between generations without ever quite becoming official enough to be investigated or dismissed. The people who tell it are not treasure hunters or conspiracy theorists. They are local residents who heard it from their parents and grandparents and accept it as a piece of the landscape, no more or less certain than any other old story about an old place. Local oral tradition about underground passages has a reasonable track record in Nova Scotia. The stories about tunnels near Annapolis Royal corresponded to locations where ground-penetrating radar later found subsurface anomalies. The Micmac oral tradition about tunnel locations corresponded to sites that were subsequently investigated and confirmed. The Lunenburg Harbor Tunnel story has not been investigated, but that does not mean it is wrong. The question of what was being protected underground is worth addressing directly, because it shapes how we think about the purpose of the tunnel system. If the tunnels were primarily practical, escape routes, supply corridors, drainage systems, smuggling routes, then what they protected was primarily people and goods in transit. The engineering would be focused on passability, on making the passages navigable, dry, and durable enough to use under pressure. If the tunnels were primarily ceremonial, sacred passages connecting significant locations in a spiritual geography, then what they protected was the integrity of the ritual, the ability to move between points in the sacred landscape without interference from the surface world. If the tunnels were primarily archival, constructed to store and preserve something specific at a location that could be sealed against unauthorized access, then what they protected was an object or a collection of objects of sufficient importance to justify the engineering investment. The Oak Island Money Pit most naturally fits the archival interpretation. Someone went to enormous lengths to seal a shaft in a way that would defeat casual investigation. The flood tunnel system is not practical for transit or ceremonial use. It is specifically designed to protect a location from excavation. Whatever was put at the bottom of that shaft was put there to be kept, not used. If the broader tunnel network served as the approach to the archival location, then the network as a whole would make more sense as a system. The passages would be how you reach the storage location undetected. The archival chamber would be where you secured what you had brought. The flood tunnels would be what protected it after you left. This is speculative, but it gives the system a coherent purpose that the individual component theories lack. A single escape tunnel has no need to be province-wide. A single smuggling route has no need to pass through areas with no trade value. A single ceremonial passage has no need for flood engineering, but a province-wide access system leading to a single archival location would explain all of those features. What was being archived? The theories have always been dramatic. Templar treasure, Masonic documents, pre-Columbian artifacts of enormous historical significance. The simple, honest answer is that we do not know, because we have not found it. Whether it is still there, sealed behind flood tunnels and centuries of sediment, is a question that requires investigation to answer. The history of the expulsion of the Acadians is relevant to the tunnel question in ways that are not always recognized. In 1755, the British colonial government of Nova Scotia ordered the deportation of the Acadian population, the French-speaking settlers who had lived in the region for several generations. The expulsion was carried out over several years, with Acadian families rounded up, separated, and shipped to various British colonies along the Atlantic coast and to France. Their farms were burned, their livestock were taken, their villages were largely destroyed. The Acadian community that survived and eventually returned to Nova Scotia, or whose descendants became the modern Acadian community in the Maritime provinces, carried oral traditions about the period before the expulsion. Among those traditions are accounts of things that were hidden before the deportees were taken away. Valuables, documents, family heirlooms, items of community significance. Some of those things were hidden in the ground. The Acadian practice of underground concealment was not unique to them. It was a common strategy for people facing dispossession. But the Acadians had been living above the tunnel system for several generations before the expulsion. If they knew about the passages, they might have used them for concealment in ways that contributed new material to what was already underground. After the expulsion, when British settlers moved into the vacated Acadian lands, they sometimes found things. Old foundations, buried caches, sealed cellars. The accounts of these discoveries, recorded in various colonial-era documents, sometimes describe finding things in places that sound, from the descriptions, more like tunnel chambers than standard root cellars. The Acadian dimension of the underground mystery has been investigated even less than the pre-contact dimension. Acadian historical research has focused, understandably, on the expulsion itself and its human consequences, on the displacement and the suffering and the eventual partial return. The question of what the Acadians left underground before they were taken away is a smaller question in that larger story, and it has not received systematic attention. But it is part of the palimpsest. The Acadian layer of the underground history of Nova Scotia is real, and it is connected to the physical tunnel system in ways that deserve investigation. In the field of archaeoacoustics, researchers have spent the past 2 decades systematically studying the acoustic properties of prehistoric and ancient sites, including caves, megalithic monuments, and underground chambers. The findings have been consistent and significant. The builders of these sites paid careful attention to acoustic properties, and the acoustic characteristics of the spaces are not accidental. The work of researchers like Aaron Watson and David Keating in the United Kingdom and Igor Reznikov in France has established that many prehistoric painted caves in Europe have their paintings concentrated at locations with particular acoustic resonance. The caves were not just galleries, they were instruments. The sounds produced in them, the drumming, the singing, the animal calls, were part of whatever ceremonies were conducted there, and the acoustic properties of the space were integral to the experience. If the acoustic chambers documented in the Nova Scotia tunnels follow a similar pattern, if the resonant chambers are at specific locations within the passage network that correspond to other significant features, then the tunnel system was designed as an instrument as well as a pathway. The experience of moving through it, the sounds it produced, the way it changed the acoustic environment of anyone inside, was part of its function. This is consistent with Micmac ceremonial practice. Drumming and singing are central to Micmac ceremonies. The drum is not just accompaniment, it is the voice of the spirit world, the medium through which communication between the surface world and other worlds takes place. A space designed to amplify and transform drum sound would be a powerful ceremonial tool. It is also consistent with the broader phenomenon of prehistoric acoustic architecture found around the world. Wherever people built significant underground spaces, from the caves of the Dordogne to the temples of Malta to the passage tombs of Ireland, they built them with attention to how sound behaved within them. The Nova Scotia tunnels, if they contain deliberate acoustic chambers, are part of that global tradition. Whether they were built by the Micmac, by pre-Columbian visitors who shared a related knowledge tradition, or by some combination of the two, the acoustic engineering connects them to a world of sophisticated prehistoric practice that mainstream archaeology is still working to understand. The documentation problem is worth examining from a slightly different angle, because it helps explain why a subject with this much evidence remains so unresolved. Archaeological research in Canada has historically been conducted under a colonial framework that privileged certain kinds of evidence and certain kinds of knowledge over others. Physical evidence, artifacts that could be dated and classified and placed in a typological sequence, was the gold standard. Oral tradition was at best supplementary evidence, and at worst an irrelevant distraction. Documentary evidence from European archives was considered reliable in ways that Indigenous testimony was not. Within that framework, the Nova Scotia tunnels are a difficult subject because the physical evidence is fragmentary, the oral evidence is not taken seriously, and the documentary evidence is either missing or ambiguous. The result is that the subject falls into a gap between what mainstream archaeology can confidently investigate and what it is willing to speculate about. The emergence of new investigative technologies has not fully solved this problem. Ground-penetrating radar can confirm the presence of subsurface voids. It cannot tell you who built them or when. LiDAR can map surface expressions of subsurface features. It cannot date them. Compositional analysis of mortar and stone can tell you what materials were used and where they came from. It cannot tell you why. The interpretive gap between physical data and historical understanding requires exactly the kind of collaborative, multidisciplinary, cross-cultural investigation that has not yet been attempted. Physical science, archaeology, oral history, archival research, and indigenous knowledge need to be brought together in a sustained and coordinated way. That requires institutional will and funding that has not been forthcoming. The academic establishment has not been wrong to demand rigorous evidence. It has been wrong to define rigorous evidence in ways that exclude forms of knowledge that are legitimate and valuable. That exclusion has left the Nova Scotia tunnel mystery in a limbo that serves no one well. The question of timing is important. When will comprehensive investigation happen? The honest answer is that the conditions for it are improving. The legal framework for Indigenous rights in Canada has strengthened significantly over the past 30 years and continues to evolve. The technology for non-invasive archaeological survey has become more powerful and more affordable. The cultural conversation about the value of Indigenous knowledge has shifted in ways that make collaborative research more conceivable than it was a generation ago. The Dalhousie study published in 2020 represents a shift in institutional attitude toward the tunnels. An academic institution with a solid reputation put its name on a paper that confirmed the existence of an unexplained province-wide underground network and called for further investigation. That is qualitatively different from self-published independent researcher reports. It creates a foundation that future institutional engagement can build on. The Oak Island television series, whatever its limitations as a research methodology, has maintained public awareness of the tunnel question at a level that would not otherwise exist. Popular interest creates pressure for institutional response. The tunnels are on the cultural map in a way they might not be without that ongoing attention. And the Micmac nation is increasingly positioned to demand and receive genuine partnership in research that concerns its heritage. The political and legal developments of recent decades have created a framework within which that partnership is both more possible and more necessary than it was before. None of this guarantees that comprehensive investigation will happen soon. Institutional change is slow, funding is competitive. The tunnel subject will always face the headwind of its association with treasure hunting and fringe theories. But the trend is in the right direction. The tunnels have been there for a very long time. They can wait a little longer. Let us end where we began, in the geological reality of the province. Nova Scotia sits on old rock, Precambrian basement rock, Carboniferous sedimentary sequences, Triassic red beds deposited when this part of the world was a desert, glacially sculpted landscapes from the most recent ice age, which ended here about 13,000 years ago. The ice sheet that covered Nova Scotia during the last glacial maximum was several kilometers thick. When it retreated, it left a landscape of drumlins and moraines and scoured bedrock, a terrain that was completely remade from what had been there before. The ice was not kind to whatever was on the surface, but the ice left the deep geology mostly intact. The bedrock was scoured and polished, but not fundamentally changed, and any tunnels cut into the bedrock before the ice came would have survived the glaciation if they were deep enough and stable enough, sealed by ice and sediment waiting for the ice to go. If any of the tunnels are that old, older than the last ice age, they would predate human occupation of Nova Scotia entirely. They would not be human constructions. They would be natural features, perhaps modified by humans later, but originally formed by geological processes. Geologists who have been asked about this possibility have generally dismissed it for the same reason that natural cave formation in granite is generally dismissed. Granite does not dissolve in the way that creates natural passages. The tunnels in Nova Scotia are constructed, not natural, but there is another possibility that has been raised occasionally and never fully addressed. Some of the passages might follow natural fracture systems in the bedrock, joints and faults where the rock separated under geological stress that were then enlarged and refined by human hands. Natural fractures in granite can form straight, relatively consistent passages. A culture that knew how to find and follow those fractures and how to enlarge and line them for human use could have created what looks like a constructed tunnel system by exploiting and modifying natural features. If the tunnels follow natural fracture systems, The question of original age becomes more complex. The fractures themselves could be very old. The human modification could be much more recent. The resulting feature would be neither fully natural nor fully constructed, but something in between, a collaboration between geology and human intention that does not fit neatly into either category. This is speculation, but it is geologically plausible speculation. The fracture systems in Nova Scotia bedrock have been mapped for oil and gas exploration purposes. Comparing those maps with the known tunnel locations would be a straightforward piece of desk research that, as far as the record shows, has never been done. The ground beneath Nova Scotia is hollow. The farmers know it. Their horses have broken through into it. Their barns have settled over it. Their wells have tapped into it and come up tasting of stone. The Micmac know it. They have always known it. Their stories say so, and their ceremony honors it, and their knowledge keepers have maintained the memory of it through centuries, when no one with institutional authority was interested in listening. The historians know it, or at least the honest ones do. The evidence is in the archives. The reports are in the museums. The photographs are in the files. The radar data is on the hard drives. The confirmation is in the published literature, if you look for it. What the historians have not done is explain it. And there is a difference between knowing something and explaining it, between acknowledging evidence and understanding what it means. The tunnels beneath Nova Scotia are evidence of something. They are evidence of people across time deciding that what was underground was important enough to build, to maintain, to protect, and to remember. People made these things. People with knowledge and skill and purpose. People who believed that what they were doing mattered enough to dig into the bedrock of a peninsula on the edge of a cold ocean and make something that would last. It has lasted. The historian still cannot explain it, but the ground still knows. The ground remembers everyone who has moved through it, everyone who built inside it, everyone who sealed it and protected it and passed the knowledge of it to the next generation. The ground is patient. It will keep its memory until someone is ready to receive it. Maybe that time is coming. Maybe it is already here if we are willing to go underground and listen. The men who built the Aboiteaux knew water. They understood tidal flow in a way that no textbook had taught them, because the textbooks they had access to were written for European conditions, and the Bay of Fundy behaves unlike any body of water in Europe. The Acadians learned by doing, by watching the tides, by failing and rebuilding, by developing over generations a sophisticated, intuitive understanding of how water moves in this particular place. That knowledge was practical, and it was also inherited. The Micmac had been living with the Bay of Fundy for thousands of years before the first Acadian dike was built. The relationship between the two communities was complicated and sometimes hostile, but it was also, at various times and in various ways, one of knowledge exchange. The Acadians learned from the Micmac. It would be surprising if that learning did not extend to knowledge of the land and what lay beneath it. The Aboiteaux are often described as a uniquely Acadian achievement, which in one sense they are. The specific technology of the sluice gate dike system is Acadian in its particular form, but the understanding of tidal hydrology that underlies it is older and more widely distributed, and it is at least plausible that some of what the Acadians knew about the water and the earth they learned from people who had been studying both for much longer. If the Micmac had knowledge of underground water management, of how to build structures that worked with tidal pressure rather than against it, and if they shared some of that knowledge with the Acadians, then the Acadian dike system and the underground tunnel system might be related in ways we have not previously considered. Both involve sophisticated management of water in a tidal environment. Both require detailed local knowledge. Both left physical evidence that has survived centuries of subsequent occupation. The overlap is not proof of anything, but it is a connection that deserves examination. The history of European claims to have discovered Nova Scotia before Columbus is longer and more complicated than is generally appreciated. The Norse are the most securely documented case. L'Anse aux Meadows in northern Newfoundland is confirmed Norse occupation from approximately 1000 CE. The sagas describe lands to the west and south of Greenland, Vinland, Markland, and Helluland that most historians identify as parts of northeastern North America. Whether any of those lands include what is now Nova Scotia depends on the interpretation of ambiguous geographical descriptions in texts written centuries after the voyages they describe. But the Norse are not the only European candidates for pre-Columbian contact. Irish monks, the Peregrini pro Christo, who sought isolation in the North Atlantic in the early medieval period, certainly reached the Faroe Islands and Iceland. The question of whether they reached further west has been debated since at least the 17th century. The accounts of St. Brendan's voyage, written in the 9th century, but possibly preserving memories of real journeys, describe lands far to the west that some researchers have identified as North America. Basque fishermen were almost certainly fishing on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland before Columbus sailed, possibly significantly before. The Basque whaling and fishing operations in the western North Atlantic in the 16th century were extensive and knowledgeable in ways that suggest long familiarity with the region. Some researchers argue that Basque contact with the Newfoundland and Labrador coast predates Columbus by a century or more. Welsh tradition holds that a prince named Madog ap Owain Gwynedd sailed west in 1170 and found a new land. The Madog tradition was taken seriously enough in the colonial period that it influenced British claims to North America, and it has been investigated seriously enough to produce a body of inconclusive but interesting research. The Phoenician theory, which holds that Semitic traders from the ancient Mediterranean reached North America before the Christian era, is generally dismissed by mainstream historians as evidence-free speculation. But some of the specific claims made for Phoenician contact in North America are based on artifact evidence that has not been definitively debunked. None of these cases is proven. Most are significantly weaker than the Norse case. But the pattern they suggest of sustained and possibly extensive contact between Europe and North America in the centuries and millennia before Columbus is consistent with what the tunnel evidence implies. If people were crossing the Atlantic repeatedly in various periods, for various reasons, Nova Scotia, the closest point of North America to northern Europe, is where they would most likely arrive. The tunnel system, if it was built partly by or for pre-Columbian visitors, would be the most durable physical evidence of those visits, more durable than wooden ships which do not survive, more durable than organic artifacts which decompose. Stone structures underground, protected from weathering, are the best possible medium for preserving a record of human presence across long time periods. There is a quality to certain kinds of historical mystery that is different from the quality of merely unsolved questions. Some questions are unsolved because the evidence is insufficient. The solution exists, but we cannot currently reach it with the evidence we have. More evidence would solve the problem. The Nova Scotia tunnel mystery has some of that character. More investigation would certainly add to our understanding, but it also has a different quality, the quality of a question that challenges the frameworks we use to ask questions in the first place. When we ask who built the tunnels, we assume that the answer will be a population we already know about, whose presence in Nova Scotia is already documented, whose technological capabilities are already understood. The interesting possibility that the tunnel mystery raises is that the answer might be a population we do not already know about, or a capability we have not previously attributed to a population we thought we understood, or a form of knowledge transmission across cultures and distances that our current historical models do not accommodate. That possibility is uncomfortable for historians because it requires revising frameworks that are well established and widely accepted. The revision might be small, a modest expansion of what we know about pre-contact technology or a confirmation of a specific pre-Columbian contact event. Or it might be large, a fundamental reconsideration of how knowledge and technology moved around the pre-contact world and what the history of human civilization on a global scale actually looks like. The history of archaeology is full of cases where the large revision turned out to be required. The discovery of the Minoan civilization, the confirmation of Troy, the revelation of the extent and sophistication of Cahokia, the recognition of the Amazon's pre-contact agricultural civilization, all of these required revising frameworks that seemed well established at the time. The revisions were resisted. They were ultimately accepted because the evidence was undeniable. The evidence for the Nova Scotia tunnel system is not yet undeniable in that sense. It is substantial and accumulating, but it has not reached the threshold that compels institutional revision. Getting it there requires the comprehensive investigation that has not yet been conducted. That investigation will happen eventually. The tunnels have been patient for a very long time. They can continue to be patient, but the world will understand its own history better when it is done. There is a particular quality to the Annapolis Basin in the early morning, before the day's business begins, and before the tourist buses have arrived, and before the restaurants have opened, and the gift shops have unlocked their doors. In that early hour, the basin is very still, and the hills behind the town of Annapolis Royal are very green, and the tidal mud flats that the basin reveals at low tide have a particular color, gray and brown and faintly iridescent, that reminds you that you are standing at the edge of one of the most dynamic tidal environments on the planet. The original Port Royal stood near here. The French flag was planted here in 1605. The English flag in 1613. The French flag again, and then the English again, and then more complicated configurations as the colonial powers negotiated and fought and negotiated again over the following century. This basin was, for a period, one of the most contested patches of water in the colonial world. Beneath the contested surface, the tunnels ran. Whether they were already there when the French arrived, or whether the French built them, or whether they were extended by successive occupants, the tunnels ran beneath the ground that the colonial powers were fighting over. They connected points in the landscape that mattered for reasons the colonizers did not fully understand, because those reasons were encoded in a knowledge system the colonizers had not taken the time to learn. The Micmac watched the colonial struggle for the basin from positions of complex strategic calculation. They allied sometimes with the French and sometimes with the English, always assessing which relationship would better preserve their ability to live on their land, in their way, connected to the sacred geography that the colonial powers were treating as a blank slate to be written over. The underground passages were part of that sacred geography. They were part of what was at stake in the colonial contest, even if neither of the colonial powers knew that they were there. When the British finally prevailed and expelled the Acadians, they acquired the surface of the Annapolis Basin. They did not acquire whatever was beneath it. That belonged to a history they were not equipped to read. The connection between the Nova Scotia tunnel system and the broader phenomenon of ancient underground construction around the world is something that independent researchers have noted and that academic archaeologists have been reluctant to address. Underground construction for ceremonial, storage, or transit purposes appears in cultures around the world and across wide ranges of time. The subterranean temples of Malta, built around 3500 BCE, are among the oldest constructed spaces in the world and show sophisticated acoustic engineering. The hypogea of ancient Rome were underground burial and ceremonial spaces of considerable complexity. The underground cities of Cappadocia in central Turkey, carved into volcanic rock, could house tens of thousands of people. The kiva system of the American Southwest, the semi-subterranean ceremonial chambers of Pueblo cultures, is documented and well understood. In all of these cases, the underground was not simply practical. It was meaningful. Going underground was going somewhere, not just escaping the surface. The underground had its own geography, its own relationships to the world above, its own rules, and its own possibilities. If the Nova Scotia tunnels fit into this global pattern of meaningful underground construction, then understanding them requires understanding the cosmological framework within which they were built. What did the builders believe about underground space? What did they think it was connected to? What did it mean to build down rather than up? For the Micmac, as for many indigenous cultures around the world, the answer is that the underground was connected to the spirit world, to the realm of the ancestors, to sources of power and knowledge that were not accessible on the surface. Building underground was building an interface between the world of the living and other worlds. Using that interface, moving through it, was a ritual act with specific protocols and specific consequences. If that framework was operative when some sections of the Nova Scotia tunnels were built, then the tunnels are sacred architecture. They are not just passages, they are instruments of connection, built to facilitate movement not only through physical space, but through different kinds of reality. That is a framework that mainstream Western archaeology is not well equipped to take seriously, but it is the framework within which the builders were operating, and ignoring it produces an incomplete and ultimately misleading understanding of what the structures are. The final question, the one that circles back to the beginning, is why the mystery has persisted for so long without being resolved. 300 years is a long time. The documented record of tunnel encounters in Nova Scotia goes back to the early 18th century. In 300 years, no comprehensive investigation has been conducted. Why not? Part of the answer is resource scarcity. Archaeological investigation is expensive. The Nova Scotia tunnel system is extensive and spread across difficult terrain. Investigating it properly requires sustained investment of a kind that has never been available. Part of the answer is institutional conservatism. The tunnels do not fit neatly into established frameworks. Investigating them seriously risks associating researchers with fringe territory. Academic careers are built on confirmation and incremental advance, not on challenges to foundational assumptions. Okay? Part of the answer is the contamination effect of the treasure hunting fringe. Oak Island has drawn enormous popular attention, but that attention has been filtered through a narrative of hidden treasure that makes serious researchers reluctant to engage. The association between the tunnels and treasure hunting is not illogical given the Oak Island connection, but it has had the effect of making the broader tunnel question seem less serious than it actually is. Part of the answer is the suppression effect of development interests. Tunnels beneath developable land are inconvenient. The path of least resistance for landowners and developers is to not report them, to fill them in, to pretend they are not there. This has removed unknown quantities of evidence from the accessible record. And part of the answer, perhaps the deepest part, is that the mystery threatens narratives that are important to how Canada understands itself. A pre-colonial North America that was sophisticated, connected, and engaged with the wider world in ways that predate. European arrival, is a different kind of place from the empty wilderness that colonial mythology required it to be. Investigating the tunnel seriously might confirm a history that challenges the legitimacy of the colonial project and the distribution of land and power that followed from it. That is not a comfortable investigation for institutions that were built on and continue to benefit from that colonial project. But discomfort is not a reason to stop asking. It is often a sign that the asking is important. The ground beneath Nova Scotia is hollow. The historian still cannot explain it. That is not the end of the story. That is the beginning of the investigation that still needs to happen. One of the strangest features of the Nova Scotia tunnel documentary record is how consistent the accounts are across time, geography, and the social backgrounds of the people reporting them. A farmer in the Annapolis Valley in 1912 and a mine foreman in Pictou County in 1887 and a contractor in Sydney in the 1980s and a retired engineer in Annapolis Royal in 2021 are describing, in different words and from different angles, essentially the same thing: a stone-lined passage, an arched or flat ceiling, a smooth floor, a consistent width and height, a sense that the construction is deliberate, skilled, and purposeful, a direction that leads somewhere other than where it seems to originate. The consistency is not what you would expect from fabrication or confusion. Fabricated accounts tend to be either more dramatic than the genuine reports or more vague. Confused accounts tend to be internally inconsistent in ways that these reports are not. The consistency of the Nova Scotia tunnel reports across 3 centuries of independent observers with no obvious reason to coordinate their stories is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that what they are describing is real. Real and still unexplained. The tunnel beneath the Hants County barn is still there, sealed under plywood. The passage near Annapolis Royal that Paul Landry mapped with his ground-penetrating radar is still there, sealed in the hillside. The acoustic chambers that William Crooker documented are still there, waiting for someone to measure their resonant frequencies with modern equipment. The flood tunnels at Oak Island are still there, still doing their job, still preventing excavation of whatever they were built to protect. The Micmac oral tradition is still there, maintained by knowledge keepers who understand what it encodes and who are waiting, with a patience that comes from 10,000 years of continuous relationship with this land, for the moment when the outside world is ready to listen. That moment may be closer than it has ever been. The legal frameworks are stronger. The technology is better. The cultural conversation has shifted. The institutional attitudes are slowly changing. The academic confirmation of the province-wide network has been published and is on the record. The tunnels have been patient for a very long time. The ground remembers. And somewhere beneath the old rock of Nova Scotia, in the dark and the quiet, the passages run, waiting, as they have always waited, for whoever comes next. There is a detail in Margaret Chen's 1962 photographs that has not received enough attention. Among the images she took of the exposed Windsor Tunnel section before the road construction crew removed the stone lining, there is one photograph that shows the floor of the passage at an angle that reveals something not mentioned in her written report. Along the base of one wall, where the floor stone meets the wall stone, there is a line of smaller stones set differently from the rest at a slight angle, creating a channel about 10 centimeters wide. The channel runs the length of the visible section and presumably beyond. Chen noted the cambered floor in her report. She did not specifically describe this edge channel. It may be that she did not notice it, or that she did not consider it significant enough to mention. But the channel is visible in the photograph, and it is consistent with a drainage design of considerable sophistication. A cambered floor that directs water toward one wall, combined with a channel at the wall base that collects and moves that water along the length of the tunnel, is a functional drainage system of the same kind used in Roman aqueducts and medieval European construction. It is not the kind of feature you include in a temporary emergency passage. It is the kind of feature you include in a passage that is expected to carry foot traffic over a long period in a wet climate, where standing water would make the floor slippery and dangerous. Someone designed that floor to be walked on safely. Someone planned for the rain that would seep through the overburden and pool in the passage and needed to go somewhere. Someone thought about the long-term maintenance of the passage and built the drainage system into it from the beginning. That kind of thinking, that kind of forward planning in construction is the signature of a sophisticated engineering tradition. It is the signature of people who had built many passages before this one, who knew what problems arose in the second decade and the fifth decade of a tunnel's life, and who solved those problems in the original construction. The drainage channel in Chen's photograph is 60 years old as a photograph and unknown centuries old as a feature. It is a small detail, but small details are often where the real information lives, in the choices that builders make when no one is watching, when they are solving practical problems that arise in the actual work of construction. The builders of the Windsor Tunnel solved the drainage problem well. They had done it before. They knew how. That knowledge came from somewhere. Finding where it came from is the work that still needs to be done. The mysterious tunnels beneath Nova Scotia that historians still can't explain. Still mysterious. Still beneath the ground. Still waiting. There is something worth saying about the people who have spent their lives on this question and received very little in return. Douglas Chamberlain gave decades to the Annapolis Valley accounts and died without institutional recognition. Margaret Chen filed her photographs and her measurements and heard nothing back. William Crooker self-published because no publisher with a major imprint would touch the subject. Robert Macaulay accumulated documentation in Cape Breton until his death, and his papers are in boxes. Paul Landry retired from a career as an engineer, brought his professional skills to bear on a hillside near Annapolis Royal, submitted his radar images to the Provincial Museum, and also heard nothing back. These are not credulous people chasing fantasy. They are methodical people who encountered something they could not explain and did the responsible thing, which is to document it carefully and report it to the institutions whose job it is to follow up. The institutions did not follow up. That failure is not neutral. Every time a report goes unaddressed, the evidence window closes a little more. The tunnel system that exists today is smaller and less accessible than the one that existed a generation ago. The ground remembers, but it does not remember forever.